Hi, Terry here, and welcome to Times Gone Tech. If you might remember, if you've been tuning into my videos, my last video that I did was about the Birkeland reactor for producing nitric acid using air, electricity, and water. Well, if you're wondering how that little experiment is going, it's still buzzing and bubbling away. The design that I'm using is so inefficient, it could be months before it produces anything resembling a liter of nitric acid, which I could then run through a fractal distillation process and concentrate it. But yeah, it's going to take a while. Now, the good thing about it is it only uses about 40 watts of electricity. Now, think about it. If you were to screw in a 40-watt light bulb somewhere, closet or something, and just leave it on, would you really notice a big change in your electric bill? Probably not. At least I wouldn't. So, yeah, I think it's going to work out okay. It's just going to take a while. You got to be patient. So, anyway, in the meantime, let me ask you something. What would you say, in your opinion, was the most important food in the American frontier, say in the 18th through the early 19th centuries? Well, aside from pizza and mac and cheese, of course. That's right, Pemmican. And yes, they had pizza and mac and cheese in the 18th century. Don't you ever watch Townsend? But unlike pizza and mac and cheese, Pemmican is a uniquely American invention. Now, throughout history, I'm sure there have been other versions of dried meat, fruit, and fat that people use as a power bar, emergency food to keep them going through the lean months. But pemmican, as we think of it, is uniquely Native American invention. But whoever invented it first and whatever they called it, pemmican was the very first portable, high calorie, high protein MRE, power bar, survival food. And many a native and white owed their lives to a supply of pemmican to see them through those long winter months, especially out on the frontier. Now, again, in the 18th century frontier, we're talking Pennsylvania, what today we would consider the industrialized East. Back then, it was a wild open frontier. So today, this is the last that I have of my supply. I thought I might make some more. Mm. The most common, or what we think of as classic pemmican, was made, well, out on the Great Plains from bison, buffalo, in fact. And then as you go farther east and get into the wooded, forested area, venison, deer, things like that. But in reality, whatever you had was what you used. Okay. I mean, rabbit, even fish, any kind of meat you could get, deer, anything that had a low fat content, lean meat that you could slice up really thin and dry, and then render some fat down and mix with it. That's what you made your pemmican with. Today, buffalo and venison are kind of hard to get, harder than they were in the 18th century. So I'm going to be using the modern equivalent of buffalo or bison or venison, beef, lean red beef. And since there were fish versions available, and I've never tried making fish, I'm going to make some using Atlantic cod. And then as an experiment, I thought I might use a little chicken breast and some lean pork. I've never heard of pork pemmican. I don't know if there were wild boars running around the frontier of Pennsylvania in the 18th century, but there were some feral pigs, I'm sure. And I thought it might be worth trying just to see. So whatever meat you use, it's important to understand that we're not curing the meat. We're not going to smoke it. We're not going to cure it. We're not using salt, potassium nitrate, nothing like that. We're simply drying it as dry as we can get it. We're taking all of the moisture out so that it snaps instead of bends, even. Dry as mummy meat. which means whatever meat you use has to have a low fat content. Now, with red meat, of course, that's easy. You just look for the lack of marbling. Same thing with pork. This has got a little fat on it, which I'm going to trim off. Fish, however, is a little different. Some fish contains more natural oil than others, like salmon. Now, salmon smokes really well, but it doesn't dry out too well. I mean, you can dry it, but it's still got that oily kind of texture, and oil can turn rancid pretty fast. So again, I'm using Atlantic cod, which has almost no fat or oil in it at all. And then the next ingredient we're going to need, which I have to make, which I will show you how to do that, is the fat. I'm going to render down some beef fat, which I bought at my local grocer's. And I'm going to use that in all of these different types. Now, to do this, I'm going to use my handy dehydrator. Of course, back in the day, they would have just hung thin strips of meat over poles, over a really small smoky fire to keep the flies away, or maybe just out in the sun even, and have kids stand out there with sticks to keep the flies off of it. The whole idea is we're going to dry it down so dry that bacteria, insects, nothing can live on it. So let's get started. So the first thing we need to do is trim as much of the fat off as possible. Fat doesn't dry out or cure or anything, so we need to remove it. But this beef is actually pretty lean. I mean, you can tell there's very little fat on that. So I think I will trim that up as I slice it. So we've got this pork here, and I'm going to trim this fat off. Just like so. There's just some good lean pork, a little bit of fat. I'm not going to worry too much about that. The chicken breast is already pretty lean. There's just a little. And I've never tried making pemmican with chicken either. But this is going to be an interesting experiment. I don't see any reason why you can't. Again, so long as it'll dry, it's not got a lot of oil in it. There, nice and lean. I'll trim some more of that off as I slice it. Okay, now let's slice it up. So for this stage, I'm going to use my handy little deli slicer here. You can also use a knife and just thin slice it. We're going to slice this down fairly thin. And I'm going to slice it, I don't know what that is, across the grain. You can slice it with the grain. Let me show you what I'm doing here. You can see how thin I'm cutting that. I mean, you can almost see through that. Oh, you can't see, can you? There, see how thin that is? Just as thin as we can get it. Now, the only advantage to that and the only reason to it is it makes it easier to pound or grind up later. But you can see how lean and thin that is sliced. And it's sliced against the grain. Okay, let me show you what that means. You take a slice of meat here, and you see these lines on it. That's the grain. It's like a grain of wood. That's how the muscle grows. It attaches on each end to the tendons. We're going to cut it across the grain. Actually, I'm going this way, across. Now, you can cut it with the grain. It just makes it harder in the long run to grind it up, grind or pound it up. But it'll work. So if you make a mistake, you think I'm going to start out slicing it against the grain and end up slicing it with the grain, that's all right. You didn't waste it. You can still use it. Okay, so let's fast forward here. Okay, so there's our beef. I've got a little bit left over. I'll cut it by hand. Now let's try the pork. See how well it slices up. Pretty good, actually. That is a nice, thin, almost translucent. I mean, you can almost see through it. Very nice. Okay, there's, again, I got a small amount left over. I'll cut it by hand. Now let's try the chicken. This is going to be interesting. I may end up having to do this one by hand. Let's see. It's actually slicing up pretty good. Never, never hire a cat to be your camera operator. Okay, so I got my meat all cut up. Now, there's two more things that I'm going to need. One is optional, one isn't. The one that's optional is blueberries. I'm going to be using blueberries. Fruit. I'm going to be drying some blueberries out. Now, in the old days, of course, they would have used any kind of wild berries they could get. Slow berries were really very common. Adding up a few berries really doesn't add all that much for the flavor, although it does add a little bit. Its primary function is to add a little vitamin C, which could be very important if you're in an area that has long, hard winters and you don't have access to, fresh vegetables. Well, you could get some vitamin C from your pemmican. The other thing we're going to need is beef fat, and this is a requirement. I'm going to render it down like so. Hard fat. I've got two of these, got about 10 pounds. I'm going to get the dehydrator loaded up. And then I'm going to come back and show you what I'm going to do with this. And some people, when they're making pemmican, will tell you before starting, I'll give that to the cats. Piece I just dropped on the floor there, if you saw that. Before starting, you should always put the meat in an oven at 250 degrees for an hour to kill any bacteria that might be on it. Well, that's probably a good idea. I'm not going to say, ha ha ha, but I've never done it that way, and I've never had a problem. I've never produced a batch of pemmican that made me or anybody else sick, and I don't put it in an oven first. Now, again, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. You probably should. I'm just saying I don't. And yeah, I wash everything and I wash my hands and I keep everything clean. So that does, that does help. Of course, the people who have the cooking channels right now are probably having an apoplectic fit. Okay, there. Almost. Got those chunks I'm going to save for the critters. Yeah, this is probably going to be just beef on this one. I put the rest of this in the refrigerator, and through the magic of editing, I'll be back in a few seconds to load something else. Cover this up. Plug it in. Okay, there it is. Now I just leave it until it's nice and dry. Okay, so now what about this fat? Well, I bought this 10 pounds of beef fat from my butcher section in my local grocery store. They, of course, they trim it off of their cuts and save it. So it's got a lot of hard fat. It's got some gristle, some skin, but it's mostly fat. So I'm going to dump this in the pot, and I'm just going to slowly cook it until it's rendered down into just little remnants of skin, cartilage maybe or whatever, and hard fat. There we go. Just gonna see that's not got some good. See, it's got some good hard fat on there. It's not soft fat. So this stuff will be really great. So let me get this boiling, and when it starts cooking, I'll come back and show it to you. Okay, here we are now after about 2 hours. And you can see this is going to take a long time, but if you look right here, you can start to see some liquid bubbling. That's fat. And you can see that the fat itself is shrunk down to about half where it was. And we'll just keep cooking it. This could take all day or all night, depending on your perspective. And here we are now after about 3 hours, and you can see it's rendered down quite a bit, boiling up nicely. Okay, so I let it cool down a little bit, and then I picked out the Crispities here, and that's really all that's left out of that 10 pounds of fat, 2 packages of beef fat. And here is the fat itself, the rendered fat. This is all hard fat. And I'm going to strain this through cheesecloth, package it up into pint jars, and pressure can whatever I don't use for the pemmican. And as you can see, this is clear, pure, filtered, hard fat. I'm just going to can the rest of it up and put it in the pressure cooker.